rapidly, and it's more important than ever to stay informed, be adaptable, and make decisions that align with your individual circumstances and risk tolerance.
So being proactive and staying ahead of the curve is essential. We've covered a lot of ground here, laying the foundation for our exploration of this report, but we're just getting started in part two of this deep dive. We'll zoom in on specific regions and unpack the unique challenges and opportunities they're facing.
We'll go from the global to the local, looking at how these trends are playing out in different parts of the world.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Global Economic Prospects Report.
It's like we've got this giant economic map spread out in front of us. In part one, we looked at the big picture, all the global trends and risks. Now let's zoom in and explore some of the specific regions. What better place to start than East Asia and the Pacific?
It's a region that often grabs headlines, and the report actually paints a somewhat mixed picture there. On one hand, you've got solid projected growth for the region as a whole, around 4.6% in 2024, even edging up to 4.7% in 2025.
There's definitely some momentum there. What's fueling that growth?
A big factor is the anticipated recovery in global trade. Many economies in East Asia are heavily export-oriented, so they stand to benefit as global demand picks up.
Ah, so they're riding that wave of global recovery. But I remember we talked about China's slowdown earlier. Doesn't that cast a shadow over the region?
It does, as we discussed. China is a massive economic force, and its projected slowdown will inevitably have a ripple effect throughout East Asia.
Right.
Many countries in the region are deeply integrated into global supply chains. And any disruption there, especially due to rising protectionism, could hit them hard.
Protectionism, that's when countries try to protect their own industries by putting up barriers to trade.
Exactly, and the report highlights this as a significant risk trade policy. Uncertainty is already pretty high.
Yeah.
And you've got a lot of elections happening around the world this year.
Right.
Historically, those tend to lead to more protectionist measures.
I get it. Governments promising to protect domestic jobs and industries trying to appeal to voters. But we've seen how that can backfire, haven't we? It can lead to trade wars and ultimately hurt everyone involved.
Precisely, those protectionist policies disrupt supply chains, drive up costs for businesses and consumers, and ultimately stifle growth. It's definitely something to watch closely.
All right, so East Asia faces this balancing act between potential growth from trade and the risks associated with China's slowdown and rising protectionism. Let's shift gears geographically. What's the story in Europe and Central Asia?
The outlook for Europe and Central Asia is definitely more subdued. Growth is expected to soften to 3% in 2024 and then down to 2.9% in 2025.
So a noticeable slowdown there. What's behind that?
Yeah. Well, geopolitical events continue to cast a long shadow over the region, particularly the war in Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East.
It's hard to imagine those events not having a ripple effect given their scale and complexity.
Absolutely. The ongoing war in Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia have sent shockwaves through energy markets and trade routes, not to mention the impact on investor confidence, and the spillover effects are being felt far beyond the immediate conflict zone.
It's a stark reminder of how interconnected the global economy really is. Speaking of interconnectedness, Latin America and the Caribbean are pretty closely tied to the U.S. economy, what's happening in that region.
Growth in Latin America and the Caribbean is projected to be pretty modest, just 1.9% in 2024 and 2% in 2025. That's actually a significant downward revision from the projections made back in January.
Wow. A pretty big adjustment. What happened?
Well, a big factor is the sharp fiscal consolidation happening in Argentina.
Yeah, time for a quick definition. Fiscal consolidation. That
Yeah.
sounds a bit like a technical term. What does it actually mean?
Good point. It basically means a government is trying to rein in its spending and reduce its debt.
Okay.
Think of it like tightening your belt at home when you need to cut back.
Yeah.
In Argentina's case, this means cutting government programs and raising taxes. It's a tough but necessary step to stabilize their economy.
So it's like short-term pain for hopefully long-term gain.
You got it.
But it sounds like Argentina's situation is impacting the entire region.
To some extent, yes, but there are other factors at play too. The region as a whole is facing high inflation, rising interest rates, and limited fiscal space, which, as we discussed earlier, refers to a government's ability to spend without jeopardizing its economic stability.
So it's a combination of internal and external pressures weighing on growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we can't forget about commodity prices. I know those are a big factor for many economies in that region.
That's right. Commodity prices, especially for things like oil and agricultural products, are expected to decline slightly. That's going to hurt their export revenues, further dampening growth.
Okay, so a lot of challenges there. Let's move on to the Middle East and North Africa.
Mm.
I imagine the conflict in the region is playing a major role in the economic outlook there.
Absolutely. That conflict is creating tremendous uncertainty and volatility in the region.
Yeah.
Growth in the Middle East and North Africa is projected to be just 2.2% this year.
Wow.
While that's expected to improve slightly to 2.5% in 2025, the overall picture remains fragile.
It's a stark reminder of how conflict can have such a devastating impact on economies and people's lives beyond the immediate conflict itself. What other challenges are impacting the region's economic outlook?
Many countries in the region are struggling with high levels of public debt,
Yeah.
which limits their ability to invest in things like infrastructure and education, things that drive long-term growth.
Right.
They're also facing pressure to implement reforms to improve their business environments and attract more investment.
So it's about creating the conditions for sustainable growth.
Exactly.
And I imagine the global shift away from fossil fuels is a big concern for many oil-dependent economies in the region.
That's a crucial point. Many of these countries need to diversify their economies, finding new sources of growth beyond oil. It's not just about finding new industries, though. It's about investing in their people, in education, healthcare, and technology to build a more resilient and adaptable economy.
So it's about making those investments in human capital and looking beyond the immediate horizon.
Okay, let's move on to South Asia. That's a region with a lot of potential, but also a lot of challenges. What does the report say about their prospects?
South Asia is actually projected to be one of the fastest growing regions in the world. We're talking growth of 6.2% in 2024, and it's expected to stay around that level in 2025 and 2026.
Wow, that's quite a contrast to some of the other regions we've been discussing. What's driving that strong performance?
India plays a big role in this as the largest economy in the region. India's projected growth is going to have a significant impact.
Yeah.
The report highlights India's robust domestic demand and strong investment, particularly in infrastructure.
So India is really the engine driving South Asia's growth.
It is.
But it's not just India, right?
Yeah.
That's right. Other countries in the region like Bangladesh and Pakistan are also expected to contribute to this positive trend. Bangladesh in particular has been making impressive progress diversifying its economy and attracting foreign investment.
It's great to see those success stories, but even with this positive outlook, I imagine there are still some underlying risks.
Of course, no region is immune to global headwinds.
Right.
South Asia remains vulnerable to things like rising global interest rates, potential trade disruptions, and geopolitical uncertainty. And then there's climate change. The region is highly vulnerable to extreme weather events, which can disrupt agriculture, damage infrastructure, and displace populations.
It's a reminder that even amidst positive growth, there are still challenges to navigate. Right. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's one region left on our map, Sub-Saharan Africa. What's the outlook there?
Sub-Saharan Africa is facing a particularly difficult situation. Growth is projected to stay pretty subdued at 3.4% in 2024, edging up just slightly to 3.6% in 2025.
So even slower than the global average, what are the main factors holding the region back?